Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. And we're really thrilled to have tonight one of our fellows, ASU Future Security Fellow at New America, which means that Pat Evangelista was selected, one of around 15, selected out of a group of about 350 in 2019. And she previously came and visited us at ASU, and now she's here with us we have the real honor because she's presenting her book, which was the project that we initially supported her on, and it took a number of years, and it's an extraordinary book. It's called Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country. It was named by the New York Times as one of the top 10 books of 2023, and it's up for all kinds of awards. And Pat Evangelista is a trauma journalist. She covers disaster, conflict, and human rights issues. She was a fellow at the Southeastern Asian Press Alliance, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and held a Logan Nonfiction Fellowship, this along with her ASU Future Security Fellowship at New America. Her reporting on armed conflict, as well as on the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan, was awarded the Kate Webb Prize for exceptional journalism in dangerous conditions. She was formerly a reporter for the Philippine news agency Rappler, where she led the investigative team behind the series Impunity, which covered President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. The series received a Human Rights Press Award, 3 Society of Publishers in Asia Awards, and was a 2018 finalist for the Osborn Elliott Prize for Journalism. And she recently published a book on these experiences, Some People Need Killing, and that's the subject of our discussion tonight. So we'll turn the screen over to Patricia Evangelista, and then we'll come back on and discuss the book and take questions from all of you. So thank you so much.
I'm mostly here to tell a story. In 2016, a mayor from south of the Philippines ran for the presidency of the Republic. His name is Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte told a story. He took every fear and every uncertainty, fueled by decades of failed expectations, and he gave the enemy a name. He called it the scourge of illegal drugs. He said that he didn't believe in rehabilitation, not even restitution. He believed in retribution. He said drugs were responsible for the shambles the Philippines was in. He said that criminals and drug dealers were paranoid, heartless, and mindless, willing to butcher their fathers and rape their sisters, and so bestial and bizarre that they would fuck a goat if a goat was all they could find to fuck. The enemy, according to him, was legion, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. And he said, if your neighbor's child is an addict, kill him yourselves. It will be a kindness to their parents. He won the presidency. And on the morning after 32 suspected addicts and dealers were killed by his own police, he sauntered up a stage as president of the Republic and said it was a beautiful thing, that more should die. For those who didn't believe him that drugs were terrible things, he said he would give them the drugs himself. Feed it to your children and watch them become monsters. In the story Duterte told, he said the methodology is that Duterte has your back, and he said the struggle ends here today. Fuck the bleeding hearts, to hell with the bureaucracy, there is no forgiveness, there is no second chances, and a line would be drawn. And Duterte would be standing on the other side with a loaded gun. Here was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, would give you a warning, then count 1, 2, 3. Now, in the hands of another man and another president, the story might have stayed the story. But this was Rodrigo Duterte, the Punisher from the South, under whose watch reportedly hundreds were killed by death squads he allegedly organized himself. So he could promise death because he had done it himself. He said he had found a rapist in his city of Davao before he was a mayor. I killed the son of a bitch, he said. I killed him without pity. Why should I feel pity if pity is not one of my virtues? He not only told a story, he was the story. He embodied it. Here was a man who could do things, who was different, who carried the same outrage as everyone else. I am one of you, he said. I am no one special, he said. I am just an ordinary killer. Rodrigo Duterte made himself every man so that every man could be Rodrigo Duterte. Now, how do you put a story like that on trial? With another story. I'll begin with the only proper way. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Lady Love. She was 11 years old, small for her age, all skinny brown legs and big dark eyes. Nobody called her Lady, and everyone called her Love Love, and only her father called her Love, just Love. Now, Love Love lived on the second floor of a shanty with her mother and her father and her many little siblings. Then one night, late in the night, two men wearing masks broke down the door. One of them stood over Love Love's father. Positive, he said. Positive, he meant. Positive for being on a list of suspected drug dealers and users. So Love Love's father tried to sit up, but there was a baby asleep on his chest, so he fell back down again. Then he turned his head, he looked at Love Love, and he said, love. And that was the last word he spoke before a bullet cracked across his temple. The baby wailed, Love Love's mother wept, and she tried to beg for her life. The gunman stood in front of Love Love's mother, but it was Love Love who shoved herself between the gunman and her mother, and it was Love Love who stood with the barrel of the gun just inches from her forehead. And it was Love Love, all skinny brown legs and big dark eyes, who cursed at the gunman and demanded he kill her instead. Kill me, she said, not my ma. The gunmen left, but they weren't gone for long. When they came back, one of them stood in front of Love Love's mother, raised the gun, and said, Duterte kami. We are Duterte. And then he emptied the magazine, and Love Love's mother died on her knees. We are Duterte, said the gunman with the mask. I think now it would be appropriate to introduce myself properly. My name is Pat. I was born in Manila in 1985, 5 months before a street revolution brought democracy back to the Philippines. Evangelista, my surname, means bringer of good news. It's an irony I'm told about often. I'm a trauma reporter. My job is to go to places where people die. So I charge my cameras, I pack my bags, I interview the survivors, I investigate the causes, I file my stories. And then I go back to wait for the next catastrophe. I don't wait very long. I can tell you about those places. There have been many of them in the last decade. There were the coastal villages after typhoons, where the babies were zipped into backpacks before the body bags ran out. There were the hillsides in the south, where 58 people, including 32 journalists, were massacred and then buried alive in a layer cake of cars and corpses. There were the safe houses in the city, where young girls would speak softly about being stripped naked while they're watched by white men from the other side of the world. They're the shanty towns in rebel country. They are the courthouses where generals would lie about torture and murder. I'm a journalist of 15 years standing. I don't traffic in hope. I write about terrible things that happen because those things shouldn't have happened and shouldn't happen again. Then one day, the man who would become president of the Philippines promised the deaths of his own citizens. The terrible became ordinary to thundering applause. In 1945, there was a journalist named Wilfred Burchett, and he broke the story for the London Daily Express about a nuclear warhead exploding over the city of Hiroshima. So he walked into the city with a pistol, a typewriter, and a Japanese phrasebook. And he said, I write these facts as dispassionately as I can, in the hope they will act as a warning to the world. Now, like Burchett, I'm a reporter. Unlike him, I'm not a foreign correspondent. The fact that I'm a Filipino living in the Philippines means there's no going home from the field. There's no 7-day shooting schedule with a pre-booked flight and an option to extend. Only more corpses every day. That I'm Filipino means that I don't need a translator to understand that the man standing over his brother's body, screaming putang ina, means motherfucker instead of son of a bitch. The fact I'm Filipino also means I understand guilt in the complicated way. Only a Catholic raised in colonized Philippines understands guilt. I know, for example, why a father kneels on the floor washing away his son's blood while muttering apologies to the linoleum. I know he feels himself responsible for the 4 bullets that burst into his 30-year-old son's body, forehead, chest, and skinny shoulders, in a manner that he sees as the sign of the cross. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I know this because I'm my father's daughter. And while my survival is a privilege, I know my father prays too. Now, there were corpses every night at the height of the drug war. 7, 19, 27. The brutality reduced to a paragraph, sometimes only a sentence each. The language failed as the body count rose. There are no synonyms for blood or bleed. The blood doesn't gush by the time I walk into a crime scene. It doesn't burble or spurt. It sits in pools under doorways. Or in the case of a man we found in front of a 7-Eleven, it spills out of the mouth in rivulets. Now, I was part of the night shift. It's a group of photographers, journalists, reporters from all over Metro Manila who cover the crime scenes. And it was an honor to be one of them. They're some of the best journalists in the country. But there were many, many crime scenes. And to survive it, to cover it, you have to come up with your own methodology. For me, I ask the same questions every night. Was it a drive-by, a buy-bust, a body dump, a salvaging? Was the killer a cop or a vigilante? Was there a sign by the body? Was the head wrapped in packing tape? Was the body stuffed into a bag? Was there a gun on the ground? Was there a sign beside the body? So the steps are clear, and I would tick through them one at a time. Confirm the street corner, interview the investigating officer. You sidle up to the bystanders and try to find out the dead man's name. And I've been doing this a long time, even before the drug war, but there was a new thing with this war. I learned how to stand still and listen for the wailing, because that's when you find out where the families are. So you walk up to them, you apologize, you condole, you keep your voice low and your question simple. What was his name? Where was he born? When did you see him last? How did you know he was gone? And it was important to keep it that way because as a trauma reporter, you are also aware that you are present at the worst moment of everyone's lives. So you don't ask them how they feel. You ask them for facts, what they remember, what they see, what his name was. And for me, it was important also to be grounded in the crime scenes because the brutality was immense. It is not normal for people to see the dead every day. But my job was a narrative journalist, so I would test it out every night to see if I had done the job. So before I would get into a car, after an interview or after a crime scene or after a court hearing, I would close my eyes. And if I could see the room or the highway or the alleyway in 360 degrees, if I knew that the blood on the ground was the consistency of tomato ketchup. If I remembered that the cop had wiped the blood off his hands on his shirt instead of a rag, if I knew that the piece of paper stuffed into the back pocket of the dead man that called him a drug addict, folded 4 times, was typed in Times New Roman, size 12, all caps. If I remembered that the gunman walked away instead of run, if I knew the color of the shoe, the tenor of the scream, the fact that the dead man was wearing red and white bikini briefs when they stripped him on the street, that's when I knew I could go home, that I had done the job, because I could take the story home with me. I can't write what I cannot see, and I cannot see what other people cannot imagine. So my job is to see things so that I can bring it to other people. But sometimes, occasionally, there are things that are unimaginable. In 2020, there was a viral video that went around in the Philippines. Now, those of us who cover the dead, who cover murder and death, are witness of the aftermath, never the beginnings. But in this particular case, there was a video. It was a mother and her son was shot by a cop. And I watched the video again and again. And it was only when I was trying to write about it that I understood what I was looking for. Because you see, it's like watching a movie based on a book you'd already read. The sequence is the same, but there are elements missing. I realized what I was listening for. I was listening for the thunder. It seemed to me that something as final as a fatal gunshot would require more pomp and fanfare. There should have been an explosion, a mushroom cloud, something somewhere to signal the turn of life to death. Instead, it was quick. It was a tap and bang, quick and innocuous. 4 gunshots in under the space of 5 seconds. The smack of a hammer pounding on a nail head has very little practical difference from the sound of the crack of a bullet shot at close range. And I discovered then that I had spent a decade watching death in slow motion. I built moments, movement by movement, the raising of the arm, the turn of the head, the pull of the trigger. I packed in detail with every death. I traced the flight of a bullet based on autopsy reports, and I listened and listed the witnesses, put down what everyone had seen and felt and heard, and built it into walls of text, reconstructing the last moments of a man's life. But the truth was simpler. It takes longer to type a sentence than it does to kill a man. Now, you might wonder why I tell this story this way, why I've strayed past death tolls and reportage to tell you what I saw and what I felt and what I heard. And if that's strange, it's also strange for me. This book is in first person, and it was a strange experience. Journalists are taught they are never the story. And as it happened, the longer I was a journalist, the better it suited me to disappear into the professional voice of an omniscient third person, belonging everywhere and nowhere, asking all the questions and answering none. Every conclusion I published was double sourced, fact checked, and hyperlinked. So my byline might be on the stories, but the stories I wrote was about other people, families whose grief and pain were so massive that mine was irrelevant. All this is true, but it was also true that I was afraid. My failure to take account of myself is not just due to a misplaced sense of objectiveness. It was also a failure of nerve. So the book I wrote is a book about the dead and the families they left behind. It is also a personal story, written in my own voice, as a citizen of a nation I cannot recognize as my own. The thousands of people who were killed in my country were killed with the permission of many of my people. So I wrote a book because I refused to offer mine. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was a great presentation. And for everybody who's in attendance, you can type your questions into the Zoom question box, and I'll play the role of moderating them. But I just wanted to start. I mean, you brought that around to the personal level, and to the first person you use in the book, and to the experience that you're writing about a country that you're from, that you're so deeply entwined with, yet you don't feel at home or recognize the way it operates, and said that members, people from your own country um, acknowledge, support this behavior, the death squads, the killing of thousands of people. Um, but more than just acknowledging it, there's actually quite a lot, or there certainly was quite a lot of support for Duterte. So how does that process of telling the story operate, given that he was really a relatively popular president for so many people in the country?
It was strange in the beginning because for the longest time when I was working as a trauma journalist, the job was to report on what was happening and whether or not people believed in my investigations. It was a question of whether we're pointing to the right person or if we have the facts behind us. But there was never a question of terrible things that are happening. Journalism is something of an act of faith. When you report something that is out of the ordinary, you assume that your readers, your viewers also think it's out of the ordinary and that it shouldn't happen again. In the case of a drug war, it seemed like there was a sudden sea change. There was a belief that what was happening was acceptable, was beautiful, was appropriate and regular. So that was the difficulty. That was why it was hard, because most of us are trained to report what is out of the ordinary with the assumption it would end, it would stop, or at least be considered a dangerous thing. In this case, it was harder. I think it was harder on a personal level. The reporting was reporting. This is what we do.
One of the really exceptionally interesting and in some ways surprising things about your book is that you not only spoke with victims and went to crime scenes, but you also spoke with some of those folks responsible for the killing. Could you talk a little bit about that experience, what you learned from it, how you went about doing that, and how that contributed to the book?
I can't tell you how I found the vigilantes. I will ask you to just believe I am charming and delightful, and they wanted to talk to me. But the title of the book is not a quotation from Rodrigo Duterte. It was something a vigilante told me. So, sometime in the third year of the war, there was a rumor that the police were outsourcing murder to vigilantes. And the only way to investigate that story properly is to find them and to speak to them. So, I was in a hotel room speaking to a vigilante who I will call Simon. It's not his real name. And Simon says he was a good man, that he was a father, he had a number of children, that he was religious, and that he believed that the more addicts and dealers he killed, the safer was the future of his children. By the time I spoke to him, he had already killed two, but he was part of a gang. So he would take any job. He could be the gunman, but he could also be the driver, the getaway car. He could do surveillance. And there was no job he refused because he believed this was very important. And I asked him how he squared that with his belief that he was a good man. He was a killer and a good man. He said, I'm not a bad guy. I'm not all bad. It's just some people need killing.
That conveys a certain sense that the drug war, at least those who were perpetrating it, weren't just moved by sort of a policy goal, but that they had a sense of engaging in activities that are righteous. Does that seem to
Yes.
square with what you reported?
Hmm.
And so, what helps you engage and explain how, Philippines, very religious country, how it got swept up in a sense of righteousness that involved, pretty widespread killing.
I'm not sure if religion was much of a factor. In the same way, many countries all over the world are swept up by this, regardless of religion. It can be anything. In our case, um, Duterte needed a dragon to slay, but he chose illegal drugs. But you can replace that language with immigrants, with criminals, with any other language, and the same thing would apply. So I'm not sure it's so much religion, but in the Philippines, at least in our particular case, people may have voted for violence, but they voted also in an excess of hope, in the promise that life would be better as long as you sacrifice some people.
And do you think that during Duterte's regime, that people felt like these policies were producing that outcome, that they were in fact successful?
I believe so, and there are still people who believe that until now, that the streets were safer, and perhaps in some places they were. It's just a question of the price you're willing to pay. When President Duterte stepped down from the presidency because we don't have re-election, he had one of the highest approval numbers at the end of the day, and his daughter is now vice president of the republic.
Yeah. We have a question here from Mike Buck. President Duterte famously attributed a story of himself throwing a man out of a helicopter long before he was president. His tough stance on crime and abuse of human rights have carried throughout his personal history. With China's own abuse of human rights, do you believe that Duterte felt expanding relations with China was easier to do because of his policies and personal human rights violations? Furthermore, due to Duterte's police policies in expanding relations with China and closing long diplomatic ties with the United States, did this shift in diplomacy have an effect? And does it still have an effect on the average Filipino citizen in terms of what they think about both nations?
Well, Duterte famously turned away from the United States in a fashion, meaning certain segments of the United States. Anyone who would question his human rights record would be called a son of a bitch, including former President Barack Obama, the Secretary of State. But he also famously uh, was perfectly fine with Donald Trump. So it really depends what you're looking at. Yes, it was easier that he could discount the country's human rights policy when he was turning towards China. So at the moment, I am not sure how much impact that still has now, because we also have, I mean, our new president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is now leaning into American support.
Do you feel like, one of the great stories of the Philippines is the transition, right, to democracy? Um, how significant do you feel the claim of human rights was to that transition? And do you get a sense that it's been degraded over the post-transition years?
What do you mean by post transition?
I mean, so there's a formal transition to democracy, with people power and the like, and then you have successive elections.
Do you mean
Part of that
after
transition
1986 or when we
after 86,
ended the
and then
Commonwealth?
yeah, yes.
Well, 1986 was a hopeful time when we
Yeah.
had the People Power Revolution in the aftermath of the Marcos dictatorship. And for those of us who grew up in the aftermath of it, including myself, I was born just immediately before the revolution. It seemed like a hopeful, peaceful time. But it's also an oligarchy after one more oligarchy. So, in as much as it bought me the freedom I had, people like me who were part of the free press, who believed sincerely, mistakenly, that human rights was deeply rooted in my country, it was a good time. It was a safer time in the aftermath. But it also meant that, in large part, there was a filter over the suffering of the rest of the country. People were very poor, people were desperate, and which allows for people like Duterte to rise in power.
Hmm. How would you assess the current situation in terms of how people look at drug use, at state policies towards all of this? Has there just been an end to that whole ideology and that approach?
No, we we are not very progressive in the way we look at drug use and addiction as a disease. Certainly, whatever steps forward was taken before the administration of Rodrigo Duterte, um, it's certainly a step back. So we have a long way to go to approach this properly and with humanity and empathy.
So you've described yourself as as a trauma journalist. So maybe for everybody here who's participating, you could explain, what's the difference between a journalist, we're all familiar with the term, and a trauma journalist.
Well, I mostly think all journalists in some fashion or another are trauma journalists or cover trauma. Trauma is just something extraordinary in your life. It doesn't have to be a war. It doesn't have to be a super typhoon. You get into a car accident, that's trauma. So those of us who cover trauma are people who cover people in the aftermath of these sorts of events, whether it's a building falling on you or a drug war that kills thousands. Trauma informed journalism is journalism that tries not to re traumatize the people who are involved, the survivors, the victims. It is an attempt to respect what people have gone through and to tell stories in a fashion that honors the stories.
So how would reporting on a particular event be different than from the perspective of a trauma journalist than other journalists who obviously may cover trauma but don't consider themselves to be trauma journalists?
I think it's just a manner of dealing with people. You certainly don't ask people how they feel after they see the body of their husband on the ground. You don't assume that people have the same reactions to traumatic events. You don't assume that a widow who weeps is in pain compared to a widow who doesn't. People have different reactions to events. And it's also an awareness that um, in the aftermath, people might cast you as a reporter in whatever role is suitable for the moment. They'll look at you as a therapist, as a hero, as a social worker, as all these other things. So trauma informed journalism clarifies what our role is, that all we're there for is to tell a story, to make no promises beyond what we can deliver, to look for consent again and again, and to assume that at these moments people have had all power stripped away from them. So you want to empower people who are telling their stories.
Does it make it difficult then as a trauma journalist to use people's real names in reporting?
Every name in my book, were all the names are real, with the exception of the vigilantes, because that is the understanding I have with the killers, that you will tell me your story, I will not name you, so I don't throw you into jail. So that's the deal that I cut, as most journalists do with that sort of person. But as with families, I don't think it's very much different. You get consent. Any journalist will have to get consent. Um, I think, though, what is more important, what you learn when you do these things, that consent in the immediate aftermath is very different from consent a month later, or 2 months later, or 3 months later. They will have had time to think about it, and you give them that power. If they refuse at the last minute, you withdraw because you don't want to re-traumatize. Does it make it harder to name people? Not necessarily. It really depends on who you're interviewing and what relationship you have.
Did you ever stay in touch with people who you reported on, and did that experience, how did that inform your job as a reporter and your sense of what it means to cover trauma?
Well, I just published 4 or 5 months ago, so I've been doing this book in a fashion. I wrote this book for 4 years, but actually I've been reporting for 7. So a lot of that work went into the book. So there is actually no aftermath for me yet. I was in touch with people all the way to the end, and I'm still in touch with them. And while that is a complicated thing for a journalist, I have relationships, and it's rewarding and comforting at once.
Have people responded? Have they, the folks who report on, read the book or responded to it in any way?
What sort of people who just picked up
Yeah,
the
so
book in the
like
bookstore?
those who suffered the ravages of the drug war that you reported on and stayed in touch with and then put into the book, have they read the book, do you know, or have they, how have they responded to seeing all that in that form?
Um, they seem to be pleased with it.
Does it have a sense of memorialization, do you think? I mean, some sort of like the physical quality
Certainly.
of this book?
Um, for many of the people, I mean, it's not just the families of the survivors. It's quite a lot of people in the book. People who voted for Duterte and then changed their minds. People, journalists who have been covering for a long time, as well as the families. So yes, it is. I like to think it might be something of a memorial also for everyone who was lost. So the families who have lost people I are at least pleased that the book is out there. Um, I don't pretend that the sort of journalism I do or any sort of journalism really changes the world or makes enormous impacts. But I hope that it's, at the very least, it's a record, and a record that will matter at some point where the arc of the universe bends towards somewhere else.
A related question here from Hannah Leonard. Do you notice a strong difference in the way readers in the Philippines and international audiences react to your work? And if so, how do you think it speaks to their different experiences?
Well, there's more of a shock here than back home. Um, you don't need a trigger warning for the Philippines. We know this; it happens every day. So the general reaction also in the U.S. or at least in quite a lot of places is, how could we allow this to happen? How could someone be applauded for supporting wholesale death? And I would say roughly that it's not limited to the Philippines. There are autocrats, charismatic men all over the world who know how to tell a story. And it doesn't matter if it's about murder, and it doesn't matter if it's about immigrants or whatnot. It's just that everywhere else, if you know how to tell a story properly, if you know how to sell it, then you can blow a dog whistle and say some people need killing. So I think what I'm realizing is that there are silos everywhere. People who think it is impossible for it to happen in their countries, and people who are aware that the Philippines is just one more cautionary tale. It can happen again, and it can happen anywhere, and it is happening everywhere.
And when you present that sort of message to, say, audiences in the United States, does it resonate? What do you hear back from people reading your book and people hearing you talk?
It does resonate because it's a different dog whistle in America. It's a different dog whistle in other countries. So I think, if nothing else, I offer a warning.
And you've spent so much time enmeshed in this really difficult reporting about a terrible set of practices in your country. How has that affected you? And when you began your journalism career, did you see yourself stepping into a role like that? And what have you learned from all of it?
In this particular role, what do you mean?
So, you ended up being pulled into the story of the drug wars and
Yes.
kept staying with it, decided to immerse yourself in the book. When you were out here in Arizona, was in an earlier stage in this process. You'd been reporting for the Rappler
Mhm.
and published. In fact, what you presented was some of the material from that reportage, right? And here you are years later, still in this story. I'm just wondering, how that's affected you as a journalist and as a person.
Well, the easy answer is that it's just part of the job, but that would actually diminish the what we all have to acknowledge, that trauma does affect people, whether it's first person or second person, um, whether it's just hearing other people's stories. So I have learned not to diminish it. I I guess the easiest way to answer that is to say that we're journalists are not cameras. We do not absorb, print, and delete. We keep all the stories with us and we carry them across the years. So it was difficult. The war was difficult. Covering it was difficult. And it mattered very much to be among journalists and activists and people who believe that it is important to keep telling this story. I certainly don't want to pretend that I was alone in doing what I did. There were many of us who were covering the story and many, many more who were standing up for the families. So the best way I think to deal with trauma, whether you cover it or are going through it, is a community, is to have a tribe of people. In my case, it was standing on the street, it was looking at the bodies, and knowing that the guy next to me shooting the pictures will be there the next day and the day after and the day after because he thought it was as important as I thought it was.
Do you think that you'll continue to cover traumatic events, whether in the Philippines or somewhere else?
Yes,
And why is that?
if I knew the answer to that, maybe my life would be easier. I think I think I think I choose places that there is a reckoning that is possible. It sounds trauma sounds like an extraordinary thing in general, like it's something you look for, but it's a daily thing for people who live in poverty and precarity all over the world. It's a normal thing. It's daily bread for them. So those stories are just as relevant as all other stories. So I have a compulsion to cover these stories because in the first place, I think a record is necessary in those places. So whether or not I make a difference, I think the record is important. And every story about trauma is a love story. It's a family story. It's many kinds of stories. It's not limited to just a trauma story, just about it can be resilience. It could be witnessing. It could be many things. And at the end of the day, I just like listening to people tell their stories.
And does it seem like a break, something that relaxes you to get away from the intensity of reporting in the Philippines?
No, no, I'm most comfortable in the field. So
Interesting.
the the aftermath of a book is very, very strange. I am used to publishing a story and then disappearing into the next one. My byline is enough. When you write a book, you have to show up elsewhere. You have to be at a bookstore, or you have to be in forums like this, or you have to talk to people about the book instead of going back on the field and figuring out the next story. I am learning it. Um, I am honored and grateful for the opportunity, but I do miss going back on the field.
Mhm. And so, what is it that drew you originally to journalism? Was it, what stories did you imagine that you would be covering when you first began doing this work?
I was a columnist before that. I was maybe 18, 19. Um, but around that time, I was just fresh out of the state university. I did not intend to be a journalist, but a pair of young women had disappeared into from my university, suspected communists. And I was not aware my government was in the business of torture, disappearance, and murder. And I didn't believe it. So I went out. I wanted to find out. I had a column and I thought might as well use it. And I followed that story for 5 years, 6 years, until the man who was responsible for their disappearances was jailed. They called him the Butcher of Southern Luzon. And when you cover one of those stories, you cover the next one and the next and the next. It's a compulsion. I think I think it's just having seen you can't unsee. And there are many other things. It's not like I don't seek it out either. I think it's the knowing that's also important to me.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I think it's the knowing, it's the finding out. I'd rather know than not at all. So so it's there. And
And
stories like this are bigger than you are. They're bigger than me. They're bigger than any other thing. And I like I like trying to understand them, and I just like listening to people's stories.
so did you find though in covering the drug war where there was just case after case of brutal violence and targeting individuals by whether vigilantes and police units, did the investigation of each of these cases that had so much similarity in them, did it still seem like something important in a specific way to each case?
Yes, I think it's also because I am lucky that my particular genre is long form narrative. So were I a beat reporter, it is very likely that cases would blend into each other. But because I was lucky in Rappler that I could write in long form and I could investigate, I had I had the time and the privilege to see the human being behind the story.
Hmm.
So every one of the stories, every person would be real to me. Sometimes I forget that they're dead because my job half the time is taking the body and putting together the human being again to remind you it is a name, it is a face, what happened, all the circumstances. And I see people through the lenses of other people who loved them and knew them. So they didn't they didn't conflate. The cases were distinct. But again, it is the privilege of my genre.
Do you feel a kinship when you come to places like the US and you no doubt meet lots of journalists who might be covering celebrities or sports events or day-to-day politics? Do you feel a kinship with them and their work, even though a lot of what they do day to day might differ from what you're doing?
Absolutely. It doesn't even have to be journalists. It's just people who tell stories. I just happen to cover trauma, but I am very much interested in everything else. It's just I possibly very likely do not have the skill set for all those other things. I think stories are stories. Although journalists tend to run with other journalists, and I've met quite a lot of them, and it's great. It's great to talk shop half the time.
Do you feel the similar kinship to those who tell stories that are not true in the same way? So fictional stories, invented stories?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of fiction. So for me, the way I maintain, um, I would say mental health, but that would be pretending my mental health is well maintained. But the way I deal with the daily reality of what I do is I do read a lot of fiction, and I do read all the stories that end happily ever after. I figure I am certain it is a good way to um to have hope, I think.
So you're
So I
drawn
like
to
writers, I like fictionists.
particularly fiction that has hopeful, happily ever after endings?
Yes, absolutely. Space operas are great. High fantasy, low fantasy, Star Trek too.
So there may be some among the audience who are students and even those pursuing careers in journalism. Is is there any suggestion you'd have? I don't mean concrete for how to go get a job. I mean the sort of the spirit that motivates you to keep going out there. Is there something you'd sort of want to impart to those of us who, are out there interested in stories and maybe trying to connect with what that might mean as a career?
Well, I get asked the question a lot. Sometimes it's journalists who feel there's a book inside them, and sometimes it's young people who want to be authors, or sometimes it's just journalists also who are looking for the story. And for me, I think I think it's not so much looking for a story that you can tell. I think it's discovering the story that owns you, not something you own, but something that owns you, something that you can't let go of. I couldn't have dealt with the last 7 years if I didn't live and eat and sleep with this story. If it wasn't that huge for me, that important. It doesn't have to be a drug war. It can be a hockey game. It can be a single family story. It just has to matter to you, only to you at that moment. And then everything follows from there, I think.
Do you worry that you might not find another story that grabs you in the same way that the Philippine drug war did?
No, there are many stories. There are many stories in my country that have to be told. There are many stories all over the world that have to be told. But I'm a Filipino field reporter, so I'll go back to the Philippines for the next story and the next one and the one after that. And the drug war isn't over. The aftermath is going to run generations in the Philippines. It's going to be it's going to be the children whose parents were killed in front of them. It's going to be the children of killers. It's going to be the young people who were standing on the sidelines of the crime scene tape while we were investigating, who see the bodies and think this is a normal, ordinary, regular thing. So it's not over.
Do you think there's any relationship between the severity and brutality of the drug war and the many layers and many years of brutal violence that Filipinos have suffered, including at the hands of the US government and US military? Do you think there's any usefulness in drawing connections between those patterns of violence?
Certainly, in the same way there is a useful connection in drawing a pattern of violence in the aftermath of this drug war, the Philippines has always been a violent country. So it's not limited to the last 7 years. And in the aftermath, it's we're going to pay for this for a very long time. So we are troubled. The trouble is we never reckoned with the violence of the dictatorship. We have to look first at our previous past and then our immediate past. We're not very good at remembering and accountability.
Do you think that there's some utility, or do you see any possibility or value to the kind of formal reckoning systems that have been, put into place in different countries, whether they're truth commissions or other kinds of, public engagements that involve naming past truths and seeking to engage them in a way that, where there could
Certainly,
be you do think so?
yes.
Will it happen in the
Mhm.
Philippines?
I don't see it anytime soon, but it would be a grand thing if it could happen. At the moment, the Duterte government is being investigated by the International Criminal Court, but that's a very different thing from a tribunal or a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So it would be interesting. It would be grand.
A question from Griselda Dimichelli. Demacali, excuse me, has trauma given Duterte more supporters? I suppose that means during the time that he was president. Did it increase his support, the trauma inflicted by the regime on Filipinos?
Well, people voted for Rodrigo Duterte for different reasons. Some of them wanted a strong man because they felt the previous governments were weak. Some of them actually believed in his promise that he would kill people and the nation would be better. So for the people who actually did not believe his promise of death, who thought it was just a politician talking, making promises and just offering rhetoric, it was shocking for some. For the people I've spoken to and for our movement on the ground, for some of the movements on the ground, he did lose supporters. But that's only the people who felt a visceral reaction to particular deaths. Whether it worked the other way, I think that's also very possible. It didn't deter a lot of people. His numbers were still high. It is
So,
also possible, though, given the surveys. The surveys are complicated, but there are quite a lot of people who disagree with the war against drugs, but support Duterte at the same time.
so you began your presentation this evening talking about stories and described Duterte's rise as premised on a story, and then your work, of course, is in the recounting and passing on of stories. Do you do you think that the power of the Duterte style stories lies in their extreme simplicity? And if so, what sort of stories counter that?
I think it's story and storyteller. So yes, extreme simplicity matters. Um, but I'm a great big fan of nuance. So I can't tell you what wins. I can't tell you what counters other stories. I operate on negotiated expectations so that stories don't the stories I tell, the stories journalists tell, don't necessarily make a difference. It's just the record is important. So what story will trump autocracy or the promise of death? I don't know. I just know that there should be a better one somewhere.
And on that note, are there any words you'd like to leave our audience with about your experience, about your book, about lessons learned?
Well, I think keeping a record is important, regardless of whether you're a journalist or not. I think were I not a journalist, it would have been important to me to say no to whatever is happening. Your own record is important. And in as much as I'm grateful for the privilege to say no to the brutality in the Philippines on the strength of 300 words in Random House, 300 pages in Random House, um, I think it's important, even if it's a Facebook post or a tweet or a blog, to just say where you stand. It matters to you, it matters to your record, and maybe someday there will be a phalanx of people who will say the same thing. So tell your story.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. It's really been an honor to have Pat Evangelista with us this evening, particularly because, we were able to get to know each other earlier on in the process of putting this book together and your reporting. And so thank you, everybody, and have a good night.
Good night.